Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me introducing about myself. My name is Putra Firmansyah, and here I will presentation about deconstruction criticism, and the title is Binary Opposition to Suffering from Poetry, London. The first is table of content. The first is introduction. The second is London by William Blake. The next is analysis, and the last is conclusion. The introduction. Derrida is the originator of criticism deconstruction. It's a talk to understand to the deconstructions that exist in the text and try to rebuild the meanings that have been embedded in the text. Idea of deconstruction does not accept text consciously according to the meaning of the text. Deconstruction thinking believes that a text must have hidden meanings and have different meanings. Therefore, deconstruction thinking requires process of looking for structural meaning from a single meaning that has been agreed upon by the readers. Jacques Derrida, who questioned the fundamental conceptual differences or opposition in Western philosophy, took a close examination of the language and logic of philosophical and literary texts. Such oppositions are typically binary and hierarchical, involving a pair of terms in which one member of the pairs is assumed to be primary or fundamental, the other secondary or derivative. Examples include culture or speech, writing, and male and female. To deconstruct an opposition means to explore the tension and contradiction between the assumed hierarchical order in the text and other accept of the text meaning, especially it is figurative or performative accept. Deconstruction displaces the opposition by showing that there is no primary term. Opposition is a product or construction of the text rather than something independently of it. London by William. Here I would like to present an analyzed poem by William Blake entitled London using the deconstruction theory of Jacques Derrida. London is among the best known writings by visionary English poet William Blake. The poem describes a walk through London, which is present as a band, obsessive, and improvisity in which all the speakers can find is measured. It places particular emphasis on the sounds of London, with cries coming from men, women, and children throughout the poem. The poem is a part response of the Industrial Revolution, but, but more than anything, is a fresh critique of humankind's failure to build a society based on love, joy, and freedom. Okay, the analysis. The poem describes London as a gloomy and unforgiving place for its great citizens. You can see throughout the poem that everyone in London is suffering. In binary opposition, we all know that the contradictory opposition of suffering is happiness, and happiness is a privilege. This binary opposition between suffering and happiness places happiness above suffering. Therefore, one can one can interpret this poem as a poem about the narrator who hates the state of London, how London is torturing and how its inhabitants suffer. A good reader will conclude that the narrator hates London for the way he describes it. In normal binary hierarchies, people tend to place suffering under happiness. People will do anything to avoid suffering. This poem explores the attention between suffering and happiness. The next reading more closely and analytical using a deconstructive, we may see something else in the poem that challenges the binary opposition between suffering and happiness in the poem. We take a step back from the hierarchical binary opposition of suffering and happiness and stop believing that this poem is about suffering. Something interesting happens when the hierarchical opposition is reversed. All the suffering in this poem comes from the lower class or the proletariat. This is if we refocus our attention on those who do not suffer. The upper class who do not suffer here. This this poem is not only about suffering for all people anymore, but but at its core, this poem is not only about the individual experience of London of suffering, but also about how suffering in not all of London suffers. In the third stanza, we can see that the place, symbol of the nobility and the virtuous, is a saint for our suffering in London. Also, in the fourth square, we can see how young and innocent people are forced to become prostitutes in the name of the upper class. Next. It is explained in the story that nobles versus general and upper class men were the ones who caused all the misery in London. The happiness of these people come from suffering of the proletariat. According to them, the happiness of privilege is to see the suffering of the people. We can interpret this poem as a critique of the Industrial Revolution. William Blake was a pioneer of Romanticism movement. Romantics believe in a binary opposition between nature and civilization and place nature as privilege. What is meant by binary here is that the suffering of the proletariats will continue if they remain subservient to nature or the bourgeois, and they refuse to resist the industrial revolution. And next is conclusion. From the analysis, I did above using the condition theory. By means of binary opposition, a comparison between happiness and suffering, we can find a way to read and interpret a poem. Meanwhile, the nobles do not always suffer in this poem because what is described as if they represent a laborer or slave. It is explained in the poem that London is not only terrible place, but how, who, and why the proletariat suffer. This poem can also be interpreted as commentary on how exploitative and conquering the upper classes and critics were about the Industrial Revolution. William actually missed an era when this suffering didn't exist. And this is reference. So this is for me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.